Hello everyone! In today's video I want to take you behind the scenes a bit of editing for this Woodland photo which I captured with the EOS R5, and you see what you can do with the files. So this is really a typical shoot, so nothing from the office where I do just image comparisons and quality comparisons. So this is a real photo and I show you what I usually like to do with it and how I get to the final result. So it's not a complete start to finish tutorial, but I show you some of the stages and also how the file is developed. So let's start with the series of images here I captured. So I was at 30 millimeters here and I did some focus stacking. So this photo, for example, is focused here at the foreground. So if we zoom in, we see that it's sharp here and then loses sharpness in this area. So I have another photo is sharp in this area and so on and so forth. So I went through those, and then when I got to the background here, I have bracketed exposures. So the first thing, I was at ISO 100 and I did bracketing. So a dark exposure, a middle and a bright exposure. And yeah, what you see here, those exposures look nearly different. And the reason for that is I already adjusted them. And I have another video tutorial on that where I show how you can do easy exposure blending. And the first step is usually to even out the exposure. So for example, the dark exposure I pushed by +3, the middle exposure I pushed by +1, and the bright exposure I set the exposure to -1. And this way I get them to look already very equal. And yeah, in the blending later I can just work very quickly even without using luminosity masks at all. So in addition to all those photos which are captured now at ISO 100, I also captured an additional exposure series at ISO 800. The reason for that is I had some wind here and some movement in the leaves and the branches here. So if I take photos of woodland, this is the typical process. So for the foreground to the middle ground into the background where I don't have much movement, I shoot at low ISO. I do focus stacking and then I end up with some bracketed exposures for the background. And then in addition to that, I crank up the ISO a bit, for example, going at ISO 800, sometimes only 400s, depending on what the exposure times are. And I take an additional set of bracketed exposures. And in the video where I show how to do focus bracketing with the R5, if I have movement in foreground as well, I might even employ this automatic feature to get even more photos. So I really take a lot of photos just to end up with one final image. And the reason for that is I'm always after the best possible quality. But enough talk now. I want to quickly show you this ISO 100 middle exposure, which I just pushed by one stop and +80. So if I zoom in here on the tree here, we're at 100%. Now you see it's very clean, but you also see up here in those areas I have movement in the leaves. And what you also see here, there could be a little bit more detail, which is why I also captured a darker exposure and pushed it by +3 and set the shadows to 90. And still it looks very clean. So you see some noise here in those dark areas, but yeah, it really looks very clean and usable. And this is something, taking woodland photos now with the EOS R5 is so much easier than with the 5DSR, because I can just push it even more, because it's typical that you have some areas where you have leaves in front of a bright sky. Because of the movement, as I said, I also went and captured the same photo at ISO 800, which gave me 1/13 of a second. And you see here, this one, I didn't need to push, so it was a little brighter, but still I brought up the shadows quite a bit. And yeah, it looks also very clean. So there's a bit of noise, but it's very usable. And for the very bright areas, I have to say, I also have a darker exposure, which I pushed 2 stops, and then also the shadows, which you see here. Let me also quickly show you some other settings. So as usual, I set the white balance. I made it a little cooler, a little moodier, which sometimes looks quite nice for woodland photos. Brought down the highlights and yeah, as usual, brought down the detail, introduced some masking because sharpening comes at the end of my processing. Yeah, I did the lens corrections as usual. Yeah, that's basically all I do here on the RAWs. I then export everything, TIFF, ProPhoto RGB, And then, yeah, let's have a look what I do in Photoshop. So when we look here at the right side in the layers, you see I've brought all exposures into layers in Photoshop, and you can do this with Bridge. It's very simple. And I have another tutorial which I'll also link, which goes over those steps in more detail. But let's just have a look here. This is the ISO 800 exposure, the middle one, which I just showed you. And what you see here, there's still a bit of movement in those leaves, and also the sky here is very bright, so I don't have much detail in those branches in the back. So what I did, I masked in the detail from the dark exposure, which was shot at ISO 800. I can show you how this mask looks. So I didn't even use any luminosity masks here because I adjusted the brightness before in Lightroom. So they're already very even, and I now just draw with a bit soft brush, but not too soft. Let's see, it's like hardness 36%. So I just draw around those areas and mask in areas where I had either movement in the leaves or where the sky was too bright. And I end up with a mask like that. All this foreground here is the ISO 800 bright exposure. Where I don't have any movement, I would just go in 100% white brush and just completely paint it in from this one. But as I said, I also have those ISO 100 shots, and I'll rather take it from there. So this is basically the first step, just blending those bracketed exposures. And I do the same here for the ISO 100 shot. And after I did the blending for those bracketed exposures, the next step is then to do the focus stacking. So I now finished the blending. You see here the ISO 800 blend, the ISO 100 blend, and then I've numbered the foreground stack. Now, because while the blended photos were already aligned, now with the stacking and everything, there's a little shift in the framing. So I have to auto align first. So I go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. So this will make sure that any blending I now do, the images will still fit. And it's always good after the alignment to first check if it aligns. So here there's some movement, that's typical. But if we look at the trunk, it looks quite good. Let's go to the foreground and see. So it's pretty good aligned. And what I want to do, I will bring those two to the bottom, and then I'll just hide those. And with holding down Alt, I will put a black mask on the ISO 800. So I base all the editing I do now, all the blending, on the ISO 100 blend, which has the highest quality. And what I first want to do, I want to go in again now and see where I have movement in the branches, because when I looked at the photos now during the blend, I realized that it seems the ISO 100 shot was taken during a period where there was not so much wind. So after all, there's not much movement in the leaves, and most of what you're seeing here is the ISO 100 shot, which I pushed by 3 stops and then also applied plus 80 or so on the shadows. And for this shot, I think the leaves look very good. There's not any movement, so I don't think I need to bring in the ISO 800 shot at all. And yeah, just looking at the noise level in this ISO 100 shot, which I had to push, it's very clean. So I think after all, and this is something which happens often, I don't need the ISO 800 shot or the short exposure shot. So here's a slight bit of movement, but I don't think that's bad. So I'll just discard the ISO 800 blend. And now you might ask, why all this work? Well, sometimes you need it. And if I hadn't taken it and now just realized in post-processing that there is movement in those leaves, not having this ISO 800 shot would have been very bad. So what we want to do now is focus stacking. 4 was also in the background, so I have to invert the numbering here, and I put a black mask onto each, holding down Alt, clicking on the mask icon. And now I just start here in the background, so I can just use a white brush, fairly hard, 100%, and I try to find the line. And yeah, if you're used to how I do post-processing, you know why I do it manually. I just don't like the automatic algorithm. It always does something wrong, and I have to go over the image at 100%, look at everything the algorithm did anyways. So it's much simpler to just manually find the line where the sharpness transition is and draw it in. For example, here it seems foreground gets sharper. You see here, if you look at those ferns, they look a touch sharper. And also the line is not really a line, it's more like an area where the sharp areas overlap. So this, if you do proper focus stacking, you should always have some overlapping areas, and then it's quite easy to find and draw that line. And yeah, that's what I do now. So I draw that line and then fill in the foreground or the sharp parts with white from the image and the rest with black. But I'm not going into the detail now because I have start to finish tutorials where I show this process in very much detail, and those start to finish tutorials, I have all of them on discount now already a long time, so it's quite a good deal. So I just say, if you really want to see everything I do to photo, go there. Here I just focus on a few steps, want to see how the image progresses. So now that the blending is done, I have to do some resizing, because you see here we have some gaps, and I'll also do slight perspective corrections. So I bring up the transformation tool, hold down Control, and then I can just drag down here just a touch. So the foreground looks a little more even here, because otherwise I had too much empty space on this side, and I might even crop in later. Also I pull out up here just to loosen this slight white area, and then maybe draw this over a bit, or let's just hold Control and put those handles where I want them, something like that maybe. Press Enter, so see the before and after, so just slight adjustments here. And now it's time for the contrast and color work, and I'll show you now how it looks after those steps. I can't go into the details because I usually take around half an hour for that. It's a mix of using the Nik tools, so applying some local contrast, global contrast, working on the individual colors, working on color casts, so maybe cooling it down a bit, stuff like that. And the goal is to enhance the mood which this image already has. So it was a wet, cold morning, and I kind of want this feeling in the final photo. So now by working on contrasts and colors, I try to enhance that mood. And it's quite typical to start with such an image. Here at the histogram, it's quite flat, it doesn't have much contrast, but that's fine. I want to start with a raw image which contains all the information, and then I can really bring it to the final result, which looks closer to what I experienced that morning. Not what I saw that morning, because it's always some difference between what you see and what you want in the final image, because a 2D image always needs to be adjusted a little differently to just representing 100% what you saw. So you need to use colors to create that sense of depth. You need to use the contrast to guide the viewer through the picture and stuff like that. And this always looks a bit different than what you see if you're standing there, because when you're standing in a 3D scene, your eyes are already very selective in what they pick out and how they experience this, and it's hard to bring this into a 2D image. So that's always why you have to be a bit creative in what you do here. So I've now completed the contrast and color work, and I've gone from this base image after the blend to this image here, which I think is much more effective at drawing the viewer into the scene. So the fog is enhanced a bit by brightening those areas. If you see here, it's quite flat, and I brought in some contrast. Also added kind of a color contrast, so you have a little bit of bluish tint in the fog, while in the foreground with those reddish leaves and those green yellow moss, you have warmer colors. So this also intensifies the sense of depth, and I also went with quite a moody look for the photo. So it's not too contrasty, because if you want a moody photo, it shouldn't have, in my opinion, too harsh contrast. So it looks a bit soft, dreamy, but yeah, that's just how I like it. Okay, so now from here, if we look at the photo and go into 100%, you see it's quite sharp and detailed, but not 100%. And that's why I didn't do any pre-sharpening or much pre-sharpening in Lightroom yet. So now after all this processing, it's time to apply my multipass sharpening and bring out all the details which are there in this photo already, but which I need to accentuate a little bit more. yeah, I've said this a few times already. I not show the complete process because for this I have my start to finish tutorial. So now we're here at 100% and that's the image after the multipass sharpening and everything. So the before and now the final master file from which I'll now derive the image for the web or process the image for the web and also for print and for Redbubble. So you see throughout the frame I have a lot of detail, nearly no noise. You just see it a bit here in the fork where I did some more processing, but all in all it's quite a detailed photo. And yeah, despite bringing up the shadows and also the exposure a lot in pre-processing, I ended up with a clean file. Now this is a lot of processing, detailed processing, but in the end I'm always just interested in the final results I can achieve with the files I get out of a camera. And yeah, with the files I get out of the R5, I can achieve very nice results. So this one here, this is now the master file, and I'll now show you one more step. So when I now want to upload it to Redbubble, which is where I sell prints, I need to enlarge it a bit. So the files of the R5 with 45 megapixels, it's just a little over 8,000 pixels on the long edge here. And for Redbubble, I go with 9,200, which I need if I want to have puzzles or the very large prints. And an enlargement of this size, it's not very much, but still in my Photoshop version, it doesn't look very good. So I have another tutorial where I show how I use gigapixel AI, and I'll now do that. I now do the enlargement with gigapixel and then show you the real final result, and it will look very nice, because if you just do small enlargements, what you get out of gigapixel AI looks really nice, and you don't have all those artifacts which you get if you do like 2 times or 3 times the size of an image, where the AI needs to go in and just make up the details. But if you just do minor enlargements like I want to do now, it's very good at working with the details and really getting those crisp while maintaining a low noise. And here we are with the final look at this photo. I've now enlarged it to 9,200 pixels on the long edge, and I've applied the gigapixel output selectively. And now let's do some pixel peeping. And now this is now a photo I shot on the Canon EOS R5, and I pulled it up now far beyond 50 megapixels even. I think we're at 60 megapixel or something now through the enlargement. So the combination of my processing, of using gigapixel AI and all the selective stuff I do to the photo, you can end up with a file that basically looks like this. I think this is quite nice, and here you see I need to do some more selective stuff, because sometimes, as I said, the gigapixel does some weird things still. So for example, here for such areas where you have fog, the AI doesn't look so nice, or what the AI algorithm does. That's why you have to do it selectively, so mask it. So yeah, I'll work a bit more on this, but essentially when you look at this photo, I could easily print it at 50 inches or something now and have details throughout the frame. So that's quite nice. And yeah, now I'm gonna leave it at that. I hope this was interesting, although I didn't show the complete start to finish workflow. As I said, you can learn this from my tutorials, but might have been interesting for you to see just what you can pull out of a 45 megapixel file from the Canon R5. And I have to say, processing those files has become much easier than when I was still using the 5DSR, just because of all the dynamic range it offers, and also because I can just shoot at higher ISOs and stuff like that. So that's quite nice. So see you in the next video.